So the next speaker is Elda Felix Miranda from the History Department. And Professor, the mentor is Dr. Mulry, who's here you met earlier. So are you ready? Oh, sorry.
Hello, my name is Elda Felix, and I'm with the History Department. So today I'm going to be talking about the history of Braceros and undocumented people here in Kern County from the 1940s to the 1960s. So I'll start. When I was a senior during my undergrad, I was formulating a research project for a class, and I asked myself this question: why don't we know more about the history of Braceros and Mexican immigrants in Kern County? They surely must have labored here since we are a prominent agricultural county here in the country. For those in the audience unfamiliar with the Bracero program, it was a bilateral agreement established in 1942 between the US and Mexico that allowed Mexican citizens to temporarily work in the US to alleviate the shortage of American workers as a result of World War II. We know a lot about other local agricultural history, like the migration of people from Oklahoma in the 1930s and Cesar Chavez post-1965. But I realized there was a gap in the historiography, and that gap is exactly what I intend to study. Braceros and undocumented people in Kern County from 1942 to 1965. Some of the things we'll be discussing today are the long histories of nativism in Kern County, the connection between Braceros and undocumented workers, mass deportations, xenophobia, and violence towards ethnic Mexicans. I argue that as the Bracero program proliferated in Kern County, it generated a backlash. White residents of Kern County feared labor displacement. In response and to help the migration of ethnic Mexicans, the community and the Bakersfield Police Department acted as an unofficial extension of Border Patrol in the region. Nativism, criminalization, and xenophobia eventually led to the termination of the program and set precedents for how the Mexican and Mexican American community is treated in Kern County through to the present day. So why does this project matter? I think it's important to discuss since over 60% of the student population here at CSUB is Hispanic. Many of those students have family members who work in agriculture, or they have worked in agriculture themselves, like me and my family. A lot of us want to know more about our history. History matters, but how can we use the past to deal with the present? Many of the populations being discussed are still under the threat of persecution, including people here at CSUB. This project reminds us of what's possible without these fragile and recent protections. History teaches us that we must be vigilant. The mass-scale deportation campaigns in the 50s only worked because the government violated human and constitutional rights, and many of those deported did not get a trial. Now, everyone is entitled to one under the law, regardless of legal status. And to conduct my research, I visited archives like UCLA, CSU San Francisco, CSU Fresno, Kern County Museum, and CSUB. So when I first started researching this project, one of the first sources I came across was from a newsletter in 1964 titled California Crossroads at the CSUB archives. In this document, the author described Arvin as a place where a good many farm families, as distinct from migrants and braceros, live. A merchant from Arvin stated, "I don't like the Bracero program. All the braceros do on payday is go to the post office and send money orders to Mexico. Arvin hasn't used the Bracero program. The author of the piece further defended his statement and explained, American laborers spend their money in American towns. A stark comparison between the economic contributing citizen farm worker and the economic burden of the immigrant laborer. I became a little bit alarmed when I read this document because I believe I was researching a dead end, since this merchant confidently declared that Arvin did not use the program. And as many as you know, Arvin is a very prominent farming city here in Kern County, where I confidently believe that braceros labored. Thankfully, I did not stop there, and I continued researching while reflecting on this man's statement. If Arvin did not use the bracero program, how did he know so much about it, right? As I continued investigating, I found that braceros, in fact, did work in Arvin, and it was one of the first places they arrived at the beginning of the program. Braceros first arrived in Kern County to work in the DiGiorgio Corporation in 1943. By the late 1940s, braceros and undocumented people had spread countywide, and immigration rates started. In 1948, INS arrested 48 people working at the same farm, that DiGiorgio Corporation. The plight of braceros and undocumented workers was connected in part because farmers' practices of hiring and exploiting both. Similar to the Arvin merchant statement, in 1963, the Kern County Land Company tried to separate itself from the program while trying to advocate for its expansion. In an article titled Adios Braceros in the Kern County Land Company newsletter, the company stated that they were working to extend the bracero program, but that I quote, at present, no braceros are employed by the KCL on company farming, although several of our agricultural leaseholders do hire them. When I read the statement, to me, this read as they're saying we benefit from the program, but at the same time, we're trying to separate ourselves from it. But I kept thinking, why are all these people and companies trying to deny their involvement, right? The following case might help explain it. Jimmy Icardo, the same Icardo as the Icardo Center here at CSUB, was one of Kern County Land Company's leaseholders. In the Kern County Land Company newsletter, Jimmy Icardo was congratulated by the company for breaking the yield barrier of watermelon production for the second time in 3 years and winning an award. What this letter did not report was the tactics used by the company to achieve this level of success. A report from Joseph Keegan, the immigration officer in charge of the Bakersfield office, claimed that in 1952, 33 farms in Kern County hired undocumented workers. He stated that the people on the list were repeated offenders that have, are, and will continue to use what he quotes wetback aliens. Icardo Farms was listed here as a repeated offender, and as you can see, that list was very, very long. Icardo Farms was owned by Jimmy Icardo, who donated over $2.5 million to CSUB Athletic Department, and CSUB named the Carter Center after him. The reason why so many farmers and companies tried to separate themselves from the Bracero program was because they engaged in illegal practices and exploited Mexican workers. By denying their existence, companies deny their involvement in any investigation that might have arisen. What I am trying to convey here is that the plight of braceros and undocumented workers and much of the agricultural wealth in the area was and continues to be built by the labor of Mexican immigrants, while their contribution continues to look overlooked and their presence is often criminalized. Nationwide, negative Anglo-American perceptions from the years prior were further exacerbated by the tensions created during the Bracero program to create a pervasive legacy of negative sentiments towards ethnic Mexican farm workers in Kern County. As a result, farm workers in Kern County continue to be treated as disposable and are often associated with criminality. Bracero's livelihood was doomed before their arrival and even before the mass incarceration of the 1920s, 1950s, known as Operation Wetback. Their living conditions in labor camps came to resemble the overcrowding conditions that undocumented workers later experienced in the Kern County jail. And this is a picture of them in the Bottom Willow camp, which was established in 1943. Braceros were brought to Kern County to work in the booming cotton industry, which was valued at an estimated $8 million. The buildings were quonset-shaped, constructed out of wood, and each unit contained 19 beds. Braceros in Bottom Willow were paid $2.25 per 100 pounds of cotton picked. Most average around 300 in a single day, according to the supervisor of the camp. Adjusting for inflation, this is about $42 in 2025. Braceros called this form of payment contrato, and their pay depended on how much. Their pay depended on how much cotton they picked in a single day, instead of the set hourly wage stipulated by the official Bracero contract. In fact, some farms still use this payment system today. The average farm worker here in Kern County working under contrato is paid around 60 cents per vine in the pruning season during the winter months. I actually worked there for a day and then I quit because it was too hard. I couldn't do it. Besides working in the cotton industry, Braceros also worked picking melons. In an oral history interview, Alberto Marcial, a Bracero who worked in Bakersfield, explained the gruesome labor conditions of the melon harvest. He explained he worked 12 hours per day, carrying a sack of melons in his back, weighing up to 60 pounds. Whenever this was full, he had to climb a truck driven by the foreman, empty his sack, and repeat the cycle until the shift was over. The next day, he had to do it all over again. Bill Eicher, a furniture mover from San Francisco interested in the farm labor movement, decided that to understand farm workers, he had to become one. So he applied for a job at the Bakersfield Farm Placement Service office. He was placed at a melon farm in Bakersfield, where the labor force encompassed a Bracero majority. He described his time working alongside them as some form of bondage, and I'd like to read the following excerpt from his statement. When you are out in the fields and the crew pushers are ranging through the fields, often one in front of the crew, urging fast in work, and one behind finding missed melons, the pace of work becomes killing. Fear pushes the Bracero to the absolute limit of human productivity. The company works them 7 days a week, up to 12 hours a day. Since they came from Mexicali to Kern County, they have seen little of California except melon fields, where they pick 2 tons of cantaloupes a day. Almost all of the time when they aren't working, they are sleeping. A list of the small things in their temporarily American lives which excite them or make them happy is very pitiful. There is the Kool-Aid at lunch and the chance to crawl under a truck away from the sun for a 20-minute lunch off a paper plate. There is the stir of air in the bus when it starts to move after stoking its load of 80 braceros. And there is the sight of a loaded melon truck pulling away from them Every time this happened, each member has earned about 80 cents. As you can see, braceros endure a lot of exploitation and abuse. If they complained, they were often deported, so they had to keep quiet about the mistreatment they endured. This in turn benefited the grower as he found a highly efficient labor force in the Mexican immigrant labor. This silence often enticed farmers to continue seeking the labor of the docile Mexican immigrant. Often they found this labor outside of the bracero program in undocumented Mexican migrants. As the bracero program grew, so did unauthorized immigration. According to the historian David Martinez, INS reported apprehended an annual average of 7,000 undocumented migrants between 1940 and 1943, and to nearly but the number rose from 29,000 in 44 to 69,000 in 1945 to 100,000 in 1946 and to nearly 200,000 in 1947. According to the historian Brianna Nofield, this surge in apprehensions can be attributed to the fear that American leaders expressed about migrants' transnational ties and potential communist infiltration via unprotected borders. With the rise in the global power of the Soviet Union post-World War II, I wonder if I could capture this change in immigration apprehensions in Kern County. A book of arrest records at the Kern County Museum from 1945 to 1947 listed many cases in which undocumented people were arrested and transferred to the local immigration office in Bakersfield. And if I can get your attention to the following picture, this book of arrests is divided by date, hour, name, officer, charge, judge, and disposition, final disposition. And many of the men arrested and later transferred to immigration services did not have a charge, which shows that in order to arrest people, the local police department resorted to using racial profiling. So the third part is where the charge would be, and it often just says en route to immigration authorities, en route to immigration authorities. And if you compare it with the other ones, they do have a charge. So to me, when I saw this, it immediately caught my attention. In the case of Elias de la Rosa, his charge was written here as alien. Here, we can clearly see that many of these people were not violating any laws. They were arrested because of the way they looked. It also poses the question of who was being arrested. Was it defiant braceros who protested the exploitative labor conditions in the farms, or braceros who deserted their contracts? I could not find more information about the people arrested, since their information is most likely under the jurisdiction of INS, and I would have to travel to DC at the National Archives, and that can get expensive really, really quickly. Before I show you however, I believe researching the cases of these people could eliminate the fine lines of legality that braceros traverse. Before I show you some of the pictures I found, I would like to show you the archival process that historians go through. Donato Cruz, the CSUB archivist, advised me to ask the Kern County Museum if I could examine one of their collections to look for pictures. When I arrived, the archivist guided me to the back room where the collection was held. She gave me the gloves in the corner, and since I would be handling negatives, which are known to be very fragile. I had to go through dozens of boxes to find a couple pictures for the presentation, and some of the boxes were categorized by last name. So I started to look for the last names of braceros and undocumented migrants that I came across in the newspaper. But unfortunately I couldn't find any of their other pictures, but I was able to find every single headshot of the arresting officers, which elucidates the scarcity of sources and the struggles of trying to find the voices of marginalized people in the archives. Historians call this archival silence. In one of the boxes, I found a picture of an immigration bus departing from Bakersfield. It was filed on their bus full of wetbacks being deported at the Kern County Museum. Besides being arrested and deported without due process, braceros and undocumented people in Kern County also experienced an unprecedented level of violence due to the xenophobia in the area. These tensions and acts of violence had the potential to escalate even to murder. In 1946, Alfonso Rodriguez, a bracero from Buttonwillow, was brutally murdered. He was picked up in a car by a group of white men after being evicted from a bar, taken to a field, and beaten to death. According to the doctor who examined Alfonso, his death was attributed to deep jagged lacerations of the skull and cerebral hemorrhage. And then this is how I found the court case. I had to first find their names, and then in another book, I had to look at the transcript summary, the register of action. And then here's a picture of them I was able to find of them in court, and they don't look very remorseful. They look very happy. And then here's another picture. Similarly, in 1949, Seferino Lopez Martinez, a bracero from Moscow, was murdered by Carlos Mora Ventura because Seferino was having an affair with his wife. When the Bakersfield Californian reported this story, they changed the aggressor's name from Carlos to Charles to seemingly create a divide between the citizen and the Mexican national farm worker and create public sympathy for Charles. I became aware of this change through court records. And then in the Seferino one evening, suspecting of the affair, Carlos followed Seferino one evening suspecting of the affair. When Seferino stopped at a share near his home to meet his wife, Carlos went into his house and grabbed a shotgun. The event continued to escalate, and in the end, Carlos shot Seferino to death. Many people testified of Carlos Ventura's good behavior during the trial, expressing that he was a good citizen and well-liked and respected by his Wasco neighbors. During the trial, many people spoke of his good behavior, while only 2 spoke in favor of the bracero. I think it's important not to confuse the lack of testimonies on Seferino's behalf as a result of his behavior. Instead, the lack of testimonies reflected the short stay of his contract in Kern County. In contrast, Carlos was a native resident, spoke English, and counted on a strong support network willing to advocate on his behalf. It's also important to note that the jury did not contain anyone with a Hispanic last name. In the end, Carlos was found not guilty and released from jail. After 1949, immigration enforcement and xenophobia continued to intensify as a result of the Cold War. According to the historian Jessica Ordaz, in 1952, Congress approved the McCarran-Walter Act, which prohibited suspected communists and other subversives from immigrating, and a means of justifying the deportation of migrant workers who attempted to organize. It also granted INS additional power by increasing their weapons of enforcement, encouraging the denaturalization of subversives, and for the first time, excluding narcotic addicts and narcotic traffickers from immigrating. Thus, to ensure the deportation of Mexican immigrants, INS simply had to suspect of someone's communist ideology or their affiliation with narcotics. In 1953-1954, U.S. Border Patrol enacted what they call Operation Wetback, a mass-scale deportation campaign orchestrated by Joseph Swing, head of INS, during the presidency of Eisenhower. According to the historian Kelly Hernandez, Operation Wetback was created to boost the credibility of Border Patrol. After 1944, INS appeared incompetent since unsanctioned border crossings increased exponentially, partly as a result of the Bracero program. Farmers were also circumventing the Bracero program and hiring undocumented workers directly, which limited the authority of the government and decreased the credibility of Border Patrol. Operation Wetback was enforced by using the legal framework stipulated by the McCarran-Walter Act, which severely limited the constitutional rights of undocumented immigrants. INS attributed social ills such as crime, prostitution, narcotics, and internal threats to national security. Sound familiar? To undocumented immigrants to incite hysteria amongst the public towards their presence. According to the political scientist Charles Kamasaki, with the economy in recession in 1954, the country needed someone to blame, and undocumented immigrants were used as scapegoats. By 1954, INS had deported between 1 to 2 million people. Kern County was deeply affected by Operation Wetback, and its population believed the fabrications propagated by INS. As a result, the community acted as an unofficial enforcement of Border Patrol. As a result, undocumented migrants were fearful of being perceived by the community, and to move from place to place, they jumped in and out of freight trains. Many of them passed away because they jumped out when this was still in motion. If they survived, undocumented migrants were sent to the hospital, and when they recovered, the hospital called INS on them. When the community realized that migrants were traveling in trains and jumping off near Mount Vernon Avenue, they jammed the jail switchboard with frantic calls, and that police had to be dispatched to those areas. And here's a picture of them being arrested in the freight train titled Invaders Captured by the Bakersfield, California. Now, let's pause for a moment and consider this language. The men shown in the picture did not commit any crimes. They were simply trying to avoid their arrest. Despite not committing any crimes, the newspaper proliferated this image of migrant workers as invaders, influencing the readers of the Bakersfield Californian to imagine migrant workers as criminals who were invading their civilized society. By July 15, 1953, the prison was so overcrowded with undocumented people that 180 men were housed in a cell block built for 36 people, creating a massive overcrowded condition in the local jail that threatened the health of those detained. To alleviate the overcrowding conditions, the local sheriff, Tom Kelly, suggested the construction of a stockade to house undocumented migrants while they waited for their deportation. What he failed to mention was that INS was paying him $1.30 per day for each undocumented immigrant detained. Undocumented immigrants and braceros were not only a form of economic profit while they labored, but they were also profitable while they were detained in the local jail. Ultimately, the Kern County Board of Supervisors approved its construction, and the stockade was only up for 90 days. The Bakersfield Californian referred to the stockade as a corral, demonstrating the humanizing rhetoric that surrounded the area. Undocumented immigrants were not people, they were animals that deserved to be jailed in a corral, at least in the eyes of Kern County residents. In a statement to the newspaper displaying approval to the stockade, Supervisor Webb, chairman of the enforcement committee, stated that the men's situation would be much better outdoors because they could rest under the trees during the day and sleep under the stars at night, failing to disclose the dangerous summer temperatures of Kern County in the summer. By 1955, over 10,000 people were deported from Kern County, but I asked myself, how can they do this if the local immigration office was so small? In 1942, the Bakersfield Immigration Office employed only 2 officers, and in 10 years, I doubt that it grew much larger, since the limited budget that characterized INS was often dispersed along the borderlines, which would be the border. The case of Felix Medrano in 1951 offers a critical lens. Felix was arrested in Delano by Bakersfield Immigration Department. In an investigation, INS reported they were driving by a boarding house known to house undocumented people when they saw Felix and arrested him. He was mistreated and interrogated at the local immigration office about his immigration status. He was later booked in the county jail to await transfer to the San Pedro Terminal Island, where he would later be deported by bus through San Isidro. In Mexico, Felix contacted his brother-in-law, Gary. Gary Edmondson, a federal employee, wrote a letter to U.S. President Harry Truman explaining the situation. He said, Felix was arrested by an immigration man with more enthusiasm than brains. This young man was minding his business, carrying no more no less documentation than I or any other Anglo-American of draft age. Although Felix was carrying a draft and social security card attesting to his legal status at the time of the arrest, immigration authorities ignored all evidence and forced him to sign a voluntary departure form. Gary posed the following question to the president. Suppose that this boy had not had a gringo brother-in-law ready to go back for him. If racism, force, and intimidation tactics were used in this instance without regard to legal status, can you imagine how many times something similar unfolded in the county? How many people were forced to sign their deportation? Ultimately, Gary's letter facilitated Felix's return to Delano. Although an investigation was opened in the Bakersfield Immigration Office, it was later dismissed. The officer in charge denied all accusations of violence. Instead, he explained any so-called third degree consisted solely of intensive questioning, given all cases where a Mexican national, unable to speak English and without documents, was found in this area alleging U.S. citizenship. So can you imagine what the intensive questioning looked like? After 1954, INS declared that they had solved the wetback problem. In 1954, INS conducted an investigation in Kern County where they questioned local police stations about the effectiveness of Operation Wetback. The officer in charge of the Arvin station stated, "You don't see them at the bar anymore." The sergeant of the Shafter Police Department commented on the lack of citizen calls relating to the presence of what he said, wets in the area. The Shafter sergeant statement demonstrated once again that local police depended heavily on the community's own enforcement. and methods of racial profiling. At a surface level, it seemed that undocumented migrants ceased to exist in Kern County, but further research is needed in this area. Undocumented immigrants were aware of the persecution they were experiencing, and they might have started hiding or avoiding traveling by freight train until the harassment wore off. As a result of Operation Wetback in 1954, the local immigration office in Bakersfield was closed down in 1955. As a response, many members of Kern County protested its closure, showing once again how eager they were to police brown bodies in the area. After Operation Wetback, the number of bracero contracts was ramped up to ensure an availability of Mexican laborers, since many workers were deported and a lack of subjugated workforce threatened the economic prosperity of lobbying American farming companies. According to the historian Adam Goodman, the number of bracero contracts rose from 300,000 in 1954 to a record high of more than 445,000 in 56. The number of braceros in the U.S. remained above 400,000 per year until the end of the 1950s before tapering off. Although bracero contracts increased exponentially, xenophobia continued to intensify in Kern County. Residents did not differentiate between a bracero and an undocumented immigrant. Images of Mexican men in stockades at the local jail from the years prior associated criminality with being Mexican. In 1964, a group of braceros arrived to shop at a charity store where Mark Wilcox, the retired head of the English department at Bakersfield College, was volunteering with his wife as a cashier. He explained that when the braceros arrived, they felt uneasy. Mark followed the braceros around the store to ensure they were not stealing anything. He explained that they were grabbing so many clothes, but then he posed the next question. But will they pay for it? What if they don't stop on the way out? Do you think he would have asked himself the same question if the ethnicity of the people shopping was different? If this highly educated man, the retired head of the English department at BC, held these prejudiced beliefs about people of color, can you imagine what the average citizen who did not have a college education believed during this time? Similarly, by 1964, community members and labor organizers from the Delano and Lamont wrote letters to Harlan Hagen, a California congressman, asking him to end the bracero program because he was displacing American citizens out of jobs. Cecil Dio from Delano asked Hagen to terminate the program because he believed the working conditions were considered slave labor. Instead of asking him to amend the program to improve working conditions, he asserted, "Let's send the braceros back to Mexico and put our people to work a wage fitting the dignity of our nation." Community members in Kern County view braceros as a hurdle to achieving proper labor regulations in the fields, instead of viewing insatiable farmers as the culprits of poor pay and working conditions. People in the area could not envision working and living in the same spaces as these invaders, as the newspaper called them. In December of 1964, the bracero program was terminated federally. Officials listened to constituents' unfounded claims that braceros were stealing jobs, bringing immorality, and inspiring unauthorized immigration. In 1965, Congress passed the Hart-Celler Act, which limited immigration from Mexico by placing numerical limits on Mexican immigration. Obviously, immigration from Mexico did not stop here, and people continued to cross at high rates, including many former braceros. It was not until 1986, the Congress passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, and many of these former braceros who continue crossing after the program's termination were legalized. We have not had another comprehensive immigration reform since 1986. And people continue working under the harsh legacy of the bracero program. Given the current political atmosphere, the future treatment of both documented and undocumented ethnic Mexicans, not only in Kern County, but throughout the United States, remains unknown. Despite our history, the local community of Kern can still utilize their voices to combat this legacy of racism towards ethnic Mexicans in the area. That's
Thank you. That was great. Any questions or comments? Yes.
Great job. My question is, would you say that your research about Kern County fits the typical patterns and trends within the historiography of the Bracero program and treatment towards ethnic Mexican laborers in the US? Or were there aspects of your research that you found to be unique to Kern County and that you didn't see in any works on the topic that you've read?
That's a really good question. I think it definitely fits within the patterns of everywhere else. I'm trying to think of what's different. I think the only difference is that most of the historiography of braceros, or the history of braceros, it's written about the borderlands of San Diego, the Imperial Valley. There's a lot of stuff in LA too, but there hasn't really been written anything in Kern County outside a protest in 1948 of the Di Giorgio farms. And actually, that's actually like every bracero book, but they often overlook the area because there's not much sources. So I would say that's what's different, but I definitely need to continue researching to find outliers.
Another question. How did your experience working in the field influence like your approach towards your research, but also how did your research influence like your perspectives on your experiences working in the fields?
That's a good question. Well, I was definitely trying to, find the humanity of the people, because a lot of the books that are written of braceros, like from the 1980s, 1970s, they often describe them as strike breakers, or they were, stealing jobs and everything. So, and, whenever I would work in the field, I always encounter like really amazing people. So that was definitely an aspect that influenced me, that I was trying to write a story where I show like their humanity.
Great questions. Any other questions or comments?
You've done so much amazing research, and I'm wondering where you might take this project moving forward. Future directions, additional research.
Okay. So for additional research, I definitely have to look into the role of women. I would love to do that. When I was in the archives, I did find out that there was a woman's jail in Tehachapi. So I was really intrigued by that, and I would love to look a little bit more into that, see if there are any arrest records of the prison, and figure out what their role was during the 1950s, because, if they were men, a lot of the men, I found out that were bringing their wives and kids as well. So I would love to look a little bit more into that. And there were also many stages of the program. And as I read more, I figure out I know less. So I definitely need to read more on that. Yeah.
Other questions, comments?
Sorry, I'm just, of course, very excited about your project. If there's one thing you want people in this room to take away from your talk today, like what do you really want them to leave the room knowing and understanding?
Well, I would say that, all of this horrible stuff happened because, as I've shown, the community had a big part on it. So I think what I want people to gather from the presentation is that, we're living in unprecedented times. So, we have to act accordingly and make sure we don't do the same thing as these people in the 1950s did, right? And, we protect our neighbors and our students, and yeah.
I have a comment that I really appreciated. As you were going through everything, I noticed your, background in rhetoric, the attention to rhetoric and how some of these articles were written, but also court documentation and that detail and how, they would probably tell you that I echo language matters, right? And I do appreciate you pointing those things out because, again, the media is portraying it a certain way, and as a community, we read it, and that would be something they're trying to push on us, right? So I really, really enjoyed those details.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other thoughts, comments? While folks are thinking, so the saying that history repeats itself. So do you think that, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you think that's happening today?
Yes. I think the same thing happened in the 1930s. We had there was also another mass scale deportation during the 30s, and then it repeated itself in the 50s, and it's definitely repeating itself again. But like I mentioned, I think there are a lot more protections nowadays, and people are more informed of their legal rights. So I think that's what's different about this time around. I know whenever there was like a immigration raid here in Bakersfield in the beginning of the year, there were a lot of people there are a lot of organizations here in Kern County where they would essentially be taking pictures of what's happening, posting it online, just so that people knew what was going on, so that people didn't go outside if they didn't have to. So I think it's a little bit different this time around.
Other questions or thoughts? Yes.
Just to comment on that quote, another great version of that is not that history repeats itself, but it often rhymes. It's there's a different post-war conditions and social media and everything. So even though it's not the exact same circumstances, it rhymes a little bit.
Yep.
Thanks. Anybody else on that side of the room? Oh, yeah.
So I don't remember exactly what year, but I know there was an amnesty. I think after a couple years after that, my grandparents were able to gain citizenship that way. Do you think if we were to do another amnesty now, in a sense, it would be helpful and beneficial or not?
That's a really good question. A lot of my family also gained legal status during the during the amnesty, and I think it was IRCA in 1986. So I do believe it would help a lot, but I do think that it would be temporarily if we don't really change the immigration system, because people are going to continue coming here regardless, and those people are going to be undocumented, because whenever an immigration law gets passed, it only benefits the people already inside the country. So, and for example, IRCA, I know that it provided amnesty to a lot of people, but it also criminalized a lot of things. It made it illegal for employers to hire undocumented workers. I think it also penalized people crossing into the U.S. as a, what is it called? Not misdemeanor, but the other one, what is it called? Well, it further penalized border crossing. So, and whenever you go through the immigration process, sometimes you're waiting a very long time, like 10 years, 5 years, it depends. So I do believe that until we change the immigration laws and systems, even an amnesty is not going to help much in the long term.
One question.
I wanted to ask about, obviously your research was mostly here in Kern County, right? What can you say about other citizen Mexican Americans and Mexican groups within Kern County and how they were dealing with the raceros and all the immigration policies going on in the 50s and 60s?
Well, I know Mexican immigrants, a lot of them, especially labor organizers, were very opposed to the program, because as we've learned in class, during the Chicano civil rights activism and everything going on, one of the key factors of it was differentiating themselves from undocumented immigrants. So they believe that if they were in the country, it would depress the way they were viewed in the community. So they were very opposed to the program, and they often also advocated for its termination.
Any other questions? All right, great. Thank you. Excellent.